Hi, everyone. Welcome to the State of Cybersecurity, Current Threats and Trends. We are so glad that you are all here with us today. My name is Emma Jordan, and I'm a marketing manager at staffing and recruiting firm Motion Recruitment, who is the founder and sponsor of Tech in Motion events, the reason we're all here in our international tech event series. For those of you who might be attending for the first time, welcome. Tech in Motion is a community-driven event series with the goal of bringing together the tech community to share ideas and inspire one another. After a year of rapid digital transformation and expansion, new threats have emerged that are impacting companies of all sizes across all industries. In 2020 alone, there were almost 4,000 breaches with over 37 billion records exposed, an increase of 141% from the previous year. I am personally so excited to hear from this panel we've brought you of security experts as they discuss the current threat landscape and what cyber trends pose the most risk in 2021. Before we get into our discussion here, just a couple of things to go over. As the panel gets started, feel free to submit any questions and comments that you have in the chat box, and they will do their best to get to it during the event as it fits in with the discussion. And if we don't get to it during the discussion, we will have a Q&A session at the end. Today's webinar will also be available on demand after the live session ends. So if you have to hop out for that other meeting, we totally understand. You'll receive a link via email to view the video later. Last but not least, don't forget to follow us on social so that you'll be in the know of all the upcoming events and opportunities we have to get involved in all of the incredible things we have going on here at Tech in Motion. So now, before we get into our actual panel discussion, I'm so happy to introduce to you my colleague, Mark Riley, who's going to discuss and give us an introduction into the state of cybersecurity hiring. Welcome, Mark.
Hey, Emma. Thanks for having me. So I really want to take a couple minutes and introduce myself and talk a little bit about the cyber hiring market and some of the crazy stats that we're seeing out there before we jump into today's discussion. My name is Mark Riley. I'm an executive team manager and national market advisor for our cybersecurity teams here at Motion Recruitment. For those of you who don't know, Motion Recruitment is a North American IT staffing firm. We founded Tech in Motion back in 2011 with the simple goal of giving back to the tech communities we serve. 10 years later, we're thrilled to see the community continue to grow and expand with your continued support. So this will come as no surprise, but the demand for cybersecurity professionals is higher than ever. The number of unfilled cybersecurity positions has exceeded 4 million this year, with over 500,000 unfilled jobs in the US alone. With cybersecurity, crime is rising nearly 300% in the cost of a data breach, reaching 3.86 million. Tech leaders can't afford not to prioritize their end-to-end security hiring strategy. This is something that everyone needs to take seriously. When looking at the hiring landscape for cybersecurity in 2021, we've not only seen the continued need for application security engineers and DevSecOps folks, but we've also seen a huge increase in demand for more robust blue teams. Many of our clients are actually standing up threat hunting groups, bringing in intelligence analysts that are bilingual to defend against state-sponsored actors, and even security analysts to monitor the dark web and focus on brand protection. Some other areas that we've actually seen huge demand is for security architects to help with cloud and digital transformation projects, and SOAR engineers at the enterprise level to, continue building out the business logic and playbooks there. What this all means is really a more competitive hiring landscape with more options for candidates to focus and drive their careers. The advice that I give to job seekers and hiring leaders is really to be explicit in your exact role that you're looking for or hiring for. In such a competitive market, being straightforward with your wants and needs saves everyone time and gets you to the end goal quicker. With all that being said, I'd also like to offer myself and my team as resources for anyone who's planning, hiring, or looking for a new role in the cybersecurity space. We'd be more than happy to talk in depth about trends, salary ranges, any kind of market data that we're seeing. I can drop my LinkedIn and email in the chat for anyone to reach out that's interested. And But I want to introduce you all to Nicole Betcher, who's going to be the moderator on this panel.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everyone. I am Nicole Becker. I am a BISO at S&P Global. I come from the offensive security and information and incident response sort of place. So I have a lot of experience on the technical domain and now managerial side as well. So our discussion today, we have 3 panelists, and I'm going to let them each introduce themselves. We have Eric Husey, we have Paul Lynch, and we have Ron Schlecht. So I don't know who wants to go first. Eric, you're first on the slide. So
yeah, sure, perfect. Thanks, Nicole. Hey, my name is Eric Hussey. Good day, everybody. I'm currently the CISO at a software company called PTC. PTC is a software company that is operates in roughly 30 countries and 90 offices across the world. Really, our sweet spot is around downloadable and SaaS software solutions, geared more towards the industrial sector, particularly for augmented reality, product lifecycle management, IoT, and CAD.
cool. All right, Paul.
Sure. My name is Paul Lynch. I'm currently head of information security for CubeSmart. We are a real estate investment trust that specializes in consumer self-storage. My background has ranged from application development to infrastructure and then finally to regulatory compliance. And so I've got a fairly broad background, not just in the consumer industry space, but also in healthcare previously as well.
Great. And Ron.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. This is Ron Schlecht. I actually have a background, sort of like Nicole, started out in offensive security, doing a lot more penetration testing. The founder and one of the managing partners of BTB Security for cybersecurity professional services, things like penetration testing, vulnerability assessments, as well as our homegrown MDR solution and CISO advisory services. So happy to be here. I think a little bit of a different perspective from the consulting side, since we talk to a lot of customers, but should be a good panel.
Cool. All right, so let's just kind of get into our topics here. There's a lot to discuss. I guess a common question, to the cybersecurity audience is, there's the current landscape and then there's emerging trends, right? This is just a never-ending road that we all travel being in this industry. I guess some of the latest ones in 2020 have been around, remote work and, digital transformation. I guess maybe Eric, if you wanna, as a CISO in your org, how has remote work, or do you agree with remote work as being an emerging sort of threat landscape or evolving in a way that CISOs need to be more aware around?
Well, I think yes and no. I think it depends on the background that you've had as a security leader, right? Most of the companies I work for have always had a significant, I would say, hybrid work culture. So a lot of the, security by design and privacy by design principles have always kind of been ingrained, whether the workforce is literally on-prem or out in the field, right? So I would say it's something that we need to be cognizant of, right? Because I think we've discovered a new normal in working, and I don't think it will ever go back to the way it used to be. So there's going to be, just more of a hybrid work situation regardless of where you've come from before. Your company will have to adapt as, employees probably see this more as a benefit now than they ever have.
Yeah, I guess it's got two sides here. Does anyone else on the panel want to comment? Emerging trends around remote work, like SaaS expansion or digital transformation to support that remote work environment. Do you see any threats that are sort of unique to that environment?
Nicole, I'll chime in for a second. So, some of the research that I saw last year as we were starting to move into this whole remote work environment because of the pandemic, right, was that there's a majority of consumers at this point have their own home networks, right? And some of the research also showed that approximately 10% of those home networks had already come under some form of cyber attack, right? And so the remote workforce, I think, is a trend that is continuing to grow. It existed before the pandemic. The pandemic just sort of demonstrated that it was a viable option for a lot of organizations, and that it will likely continue to be something that exists into the future. But now it's the whole remote workplace and home networks that become part of that consideration from a security perspective that organizations need to take into account for.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, somewhat along the same lines, I think my input is that, it's sort of like the microcosm of what we see in IT anyway, right? It's the IT needs or the business needs, and then security always seems to follow. I think we saw the same thing with everybody shifting on that work from home piece when the pandemic really hit and people were forced to work from home. It was the first necessity was to get people remotely working or give them that capability or do it in mass. And then, oh yeah, that's right, we have to worry about securing it. Some people did it in tandem, but I think for the most part, companies that weren't already or didn't already have some sort of work from home capability were playing a little bit of catch up because of the risks that Paul had pointed out.
Yeah, and I think also in a lot of ways, we're very lucky, if you want to call it luck, that the pandemic happened in 2020, where we were sort of well on our way to cloud transformation and consumption of SaaS software. If this had happened 10 years ago, it would have been a whole kind of different ballgame with the on-prem data center centric environment. So, I think there's a good story to tell there around, the timing around the pandemic and remote work. So I guess, our other favorite threat, of 2020 and 2021 is probably ransomware. It's such a deep topic and there's probably a lot to discuss around it, but, I guess just your perspectives, the ransomware as a threat, how do you see that? How do you plan in your orgs to manage this risk? Do you see this as solvable? What do we do about this problem?
So I'll chime in here. So my feeling on the matter is that, there's an increasing threats and increasing amount of vectors in which those threats can be realized, right? So what I've done over the past 5 years, just in my approach is really just take a stronger risk management approach and really ask basic questions to the executive leadership on, what can't happen here at this company, right? What can't we recover from? And I think that's sometimes overlooked, right? That, we focus on trying to stop everything. We spend so much time talking about phishing and, it's an important topic, but really to prevent that, it's like trying to catch all the raindrops, right, during a storm. So it's never going to happen. So, I really kind of pivoted, especially now that I'm in pure software, where things are moving so fast, they're so agile, we're releasing constantly, that we really hyper focus on good risk management principles and really understanding what can't happen at this company where we can't recover from, and let's make sure our safeguards are put in that place to make sure that doesn't happen, right? So I think that there's been a lot of trends of ransomware and things of that nature over the past year, 2 years, right, where it just seems to come up every single day in the news. But I think it all boils down to what are we really trying to protect here, because we can't protect it all.
Yeah, agree. Anyone else want to weigh in on their specific strategies to combat this threat?
I think the strategies are kind of much like the same of everything else at the very base level, right? It's assessing the threats and understanding how they can affect your organization. So, carrying out ransomware threat assessment, just kind of understanding how it could potentially affect you. Looking at the controls and technologies in place to make sure that you're utilizing what's already in place. You're not going out and trying to find a new silver bullet or some crazy software solution that promises to save the world from ransomware. And then from that point, continuous monitoring and having your incident response plan and your backup plans all in place so that you can react to it when it happens. Said this, a number of times, and I know we kind of touched on it yesterday, sort of when we were doing some of the prep, which is that a lot of these problems are really a combination of issues that we've seen before. So a lot of this comes down to hygiene, having your DR plans in place, making sure that you're doing the appropriate patching and your infrastructure is protected. And then, like I said, doing those assessments, doing the monitoring, and just staying on top of it all.
Yeah, we boil this a lot down to hygiene and sort of best practices in our industry. So it's good to hear, that should be top of mind for everyone who's working in this space. Are we doing the basics right? Because there is no magic bullet. There is no special endpoint tool that will protect us from all the things. We are constantly battling against our own. I like to call it diet and exercise, right? We know we should do it, but we don't always do it. We make some compromises along the way, and it adds up over time. So
Well,
Yeah, I'm
Nicole, you
always
brought
going to
up a
have the
good
ice
point.
cream. Yeah.
Hey, you brought up a good point, Nicole, that, are we doing the basics right? Well, the answer to that's obviously no, right? The industry has seen this time and time again, where we're not even doing the basics right, or consistently right. What we do need to do is do the basics where it matters the most. And I think that is the one piece I think that is overlooked far too often, is not everything is important, but really understanding what is important and really focusing our time there, and making sure internal audit is integrated into their audit processes to make sure they're continually looking at those places that are material to the company, and not just random sampling. Let's talk about, a backup and recovery type of random audit sample. Maybe we should think about, well, let's look at the sample that is critical to the company rather than just randomly sampling.
right, like tightly couple like the thing you want to protect with the control validation environment that you've built in a large organization. Yeah,
Yep.
totally agree. Paul, I think I don't know if you were about to chime in. It's hard on a Zoom to figure out this stuff out, but
No, and I agree with the others, right? I firmly believe, in that whole trend of it's not a question of if you'll be a victim of ransomware. It's a matter of when and how much of a victim of that style attack you're going to be a victim, right? I think there's a lot to be said about tabletop exercises, about making sure that you're doing a lot of the basics, right? We've seen so many attacks over the years, and so many new, even in the last year, so many new variants of sophisticated ransomware attacks, like Wasted Locker, right?
yeah.
That came out last spring, where it was just more advanced than any of the endpoint software was ready to handle, right? And so there's a combination. Again, I think we talked about this yesterday a little bit about layering of security as well, right? Are you doing backups properly, and are those backups going offline so that when your systems become compromised, you can restore to a backup that actually isn't already compromised, right? For one, that you can detect those things, right? And one of the rules that I used to use in the past was, a mass modification of files over the course of 60 seconds of 1,000 files or more is either somebody doing something they shouldn't, or it's ransomware, or it's the backup user, right? And I can rule out the backup user, and the other two are things I should be looking at. So, and then, there's a lot of just then bringing the rest of the organization along so that they're aware, right? If they see something suspicious, it's great to have security funding, but it's even better if the rest of the organization has some concept of what attacks look like, right? And how to respond, what suspicious emails look like, and when to notify IT to say, hey, I got this PDF attachment in my email and I opened it and it didn't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
Am I okay? Right? You might be, you might not.
Right. No, and I just see some comments in the chat, like, we are in no way advocating, that endpoint software doesn't do its job. It does its job well. It's just to build a ransomware defense strategy. It's more than just endpoint software. So I just want to be very clear on that. Yeah. All right. So I guess let's move on now. There was an executive order that came out, I guess, a month ago now, by President Biden around cybersecurity. The supply chain executive order. Supply chain attacks are another sort of emerging threat. We've experienced, solar winds in late 2020 and the impacts of that. So supply chain is also, a hot trending topic. How do you in your orgs kind of validate that problem statement, I guess, and then construct a program around managing supply chain threats?
So I can chime in here, because I think that supply chain is a conversation topic that every CISO will have to get involved in, but more so if your products are inherently 100% digital, right, in the software space, right? So, this is an evolution that we've seen, particularly in software, I would say over the past 3 years, is that, we're moving the conversation less to security, more to trust. And I think we've seen that in the industry overall, right, where we're going more towards a level of transparency to provide trust in the sector, right? So Biden's executive order really kind of highlights software supply chain, especially for software providers that do business with the federal space, right? And there's a variety of changes that are coming out that are going to be pretty impactful. And we're already starting to see this already. We've been seeing this for a while now come out of our European customers. But the concept of a software bill of materials, right? It's essentially, for those that are not, don't know about this, it's the equivalent of, let's say a Campbell soup can with the chicken soup ingredients on the back. What's in my software? What are the library versions, etc. The Campbell soup chicken soup recipe probably hasn't changed in 10 years. Software changes all the time, right? Some of us are on 1 week sprints, 4 week sprints, we release once or twice a year, right? So this adds a whole lot of complexity when we want to move the conversation from security to trust in the spirit of transparency. So there's a lot of work to be done here. And, the public sector is kind of leading the way, especially after the Colonial Pipeline and then SolarWinds prior to that. But the private sector will likely follow here because third and fourth party vendor risk management practices are pretty crippled right now, because even if you do all the due diligence in the world, you still don't know what's in your software, right?
Yes.
So the industry will evolve here.
SolarWinds probably passed everyone's vendor management program.
Yeah, those that have the most robust and the highest budgets in the world fell subject to this. So I think over the longer term, you'll probably see some type of certifications like we do, like SOC 2 and FedRAMP. You'll probably see something for software providers that maybe have their integrity of their pipeline and the products that they distribute to customers be certified. We'll see how the space evolves, but I see this as a huge risk area.
Other panelists want to comment on supply chain threats?
I mean, we've seen, from a consulting perspective, we've seen a ton of requests for third-party risk assessments, right, that fall right in line with that vendor risk management. So understanding what people that are going to do business or transact business with one of our customers, just to understand what their suppliers are doing. And it goes a little bit further than just going through and answering the questionnaires. I think that was the first iteration that we all started doing back in 2001 and 2002, but actually going a little bit further and doing some substantive testing to ensure that those controls are actually being followed. My hope is we have seen this, right, in a couple different iterations. CMMC is probably getting a little bit closer with this executive order. It all sounds good, and I'll kind of be the naysayer when I see any legislation or any executive orders around cybersecurity. I just sort of nod my head and yeah, we'll see what happens of it, because again, it's all about the implementation of it and how it's actually carried out. In most cases, this is going to require a lot of private industry buy-in, number one, and number two, private industry is the biggest driver for the need to do this stuff. If we're waiting for the government to step in and actually provide some sort of security clearinghouse, it's not going to happen. And I think the industry is really going to have to get together and figure out how to do it. And maybe there is monetization behind that, but really I think it's going to be up to the private sector on how to create some sort of clearinghouse for either software or vendors as a complete class.
Yeah, and go ahead, Paul.
I want to touch on something that Ron said there for a second. I think Ron raises a really interesting point, right, about where the monetization and where the responsibility is, right? It's great that the federal government's coming in and saying that we need to be taking a more active role in many of these things. But on the same token, there are a lot of things that don't, just because of a general order, don't always materialize within the private sector. I think one of the questions really here to look at is, do we want the federal government being involved in the security policies and procedures of private industry, or do we want to self-regulate, right, and find that solution privately without getting them involved, right? And when we talk about things like even data privacy, right, we talked yesterday about California's Data Privacy Act and the fact that this past year, they turned it into its own self-funding state agency, right? Where they can go out and find people that are violating California's new privacy laws and potentially generate their own funds, right? So now there's a risk that's real to organizations, and the more people that that government agency finds, in violation, they're basically printing their own money at that point, right? So how much of it do we want to regulate ourselves versus eventually have that federal government come in and force us to be regulated? And I think it's probably better for us, as industries to self-regulate.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, it's probably a evaluation of the things that incentivize practitioners and companies in the cybersecurity domain, right? In my opinion, maybe there are misaligned incentives, right? Where it's more costly for me to do the right thing and cheaper for me to do the wrong thing. And do we need to rebalance that? And what would that look like? Is that a framework? Is that legislation? Is that an executive order? Is that just the industry kind of, trying to SRO or self-regulate itself? But I do feel that I agree with everyone here that there is an incentive misalignment more broadly in the whole domain. Yeah. All right. So, I mean, let's pivot into something that is, more on the defensive side, like how to protect against, how to solve problems, mitigate attacks, things like that. So I guess, when we talk about, responding to threats and threat hunting and security automation, have you found that, automation of your incident response has been helpful to sort of speed up that mean time to remediate cycle that we're all trying to drive towards? Has there been success in your organizations around incident response automation?
So I'll chime in with that one. So I would say the short answer is yes, right? So, in the current organization, and I've been in larger organizations most of my career. And so, I've had the benefit of having, decent sized teams, but even so, usually the team is commensurate with I would say the business complexity and the supporting infrastructure that you need to manage, right? So I think over time, what we've seen is that, anytime we can take advantage of automation, whether it's homegrown or through SOAR, which we're investing heavily in and have been for about the past year, it's going to give your analysts more time to do the diligence on the things that really matter the most, right? So, yeah, I think that we're seeing companies, generally speaking, start to invest a little bit more in SOAR. I think there's going to be
just going to stop you. For those that might not be familiar with the term SOAR, can you just define it for the audience?
Yeah, it's basically superior orchestration and automation, right? So basically taking common tasks. It's, for those of us that are not in security, it's the equivalent almost of RPA, robotics process automation, right? So, taking, and automating simple tasks. For example, if an analyst goes and gets a malware ticket, right? They would automatically get maybe the payload already scraped up into the ticket, all of the supporting data, compare that against IOCs from, threat detection platforms like Anomaly or Recorder Future, and just scrape it all in, right? So it saves the analyst time from having to go to those distinct areas. Or, you could just automate the actions themselves, right? So like take the endpoint offline, disable, prompt for a multi-factor authentication attempt again, or just disable an account, right? So simple. Try to automate as much as we can. So yeah, we're starting to leverage that heavily because it seems that the amount of data coming in is ever increasing, and a lot of it is actionable now to a certain extent. So those areas where we can find efficiency, we're taking full advantage of it, because while I would say the security market is hot, for those of us that have, I would say, more well-established programs, it's not like we have, we're not increasing our staff by 100% year over year, right? You're seeing that for companies that probably have 2 to 3 security people and they're going to 6 next year, right? You're not seeing that with like, hey, I'm going to go from 40 to 80, right? So we need to leverage, technology as much as we can. So I am seeing an investment across the sector in these tools.
Great. Does Ron, do you have experience deploying or implementing sort of SOAR-like tools that have proven themselves to be useful in a threat hunting and threat detection place?
Yeah, and I mean, I'll spare you the shameless plug for what we do on our MDR service, but that's kind of, what we've put together, right? It's the tool to allow our analysts to do that threat hunting, that analysis easier and faster, right? That's the name of the game. It's not that there's, I mean, obviously there's tons of special sauce built in terms of how you're finding things and how you're how you're looking for that information. But when it comes down to it, really good tools help you bubble up the really good stuff that your analysts can look at and make decisions on, and then also help you very quickly suppress the stuff that is junk or just noise in the environment. So when you look at it, when you look at these tools, that's really the key functionality around that stuff. Obviously, there's a lot of good intelligence built into it, but the real machine learning aspect, to use a lovely buzzword, is the fact that it aids you in sorting out what's good and what's bad. There's not any magic out there. There's not a big robot like Ken Jennings fights in Jeopardy that's making like complex decisions. It's really just, like I said, making the technology smarter to allow analysts to make better decisions or see things faster, and then using it in that way. The source stuff, I think it's beneficial and it's very useful, but even across all of our clients, people are very, I don't want to say hesitant, but people like dip their toes in the water. Like, all right, like we're going to use a block list and we're going to use it for all of our firewalls. But that's the first thing that we want to do, right? And then as far as like dynamic block lists or whatever it may be, people are like, they want to get into that, but they're not full on like, let's hook it to everything and orchestrate everything. I think people are still a little bit hesitant to go all in on the technology, even though it's nice to know that the capability is there.
Yeah.
So I have a slightly different approach to this, and more so probably because I've got a smaller security team, right? And I'll relate to the fact of there are a lot of organizations out there that I've met over the years who they're lucky if they have one person in their IT department that is responsible for security or security and half a dozen other things, right? And I'm a huge advocate around the automation side, right? And those tasks that you can automate, it is a huge benefit. But then there tend to be a lot of one-off tasks that aren't as easily automated in terms of detection and response that end up ultimately consuming people's time. Where I have gone in my journey over the years, because I did work at one point in time for an MSSP, and then to a nonprofit, and then into the for-profit space, is I've sort of reached a point where my conclusion is that there's a size of an organization that can manage their own SOC effectively, but there's a larger number of smaller organizations that usually don't have the resources in order to put that SOC or even that automation fully in place, right? And so, for example, where I'm at right now, I use an external managed SOC service, and so their automation helps improve their ability to consume all of the different data, right? And to sort of chime in on a thread that I saw in the chat for a second, right? It's not just about AI versus AV, right? Because one of the data sources, surely, that I provide my SOC is antivirus and endpoint protection, but I'm also providing them firewall data and email data and log data from controllers and all sorts of different data sources in order to look for potential suspicious activity that's more than just malware, right?
Sure.
Like I saw a particular activity this morning that was just 350 login attempts that all failed, right? Over a 10-minute period that were all coming from one location, right? Now, having that ability to have somebody that brings all of this information in and they can monitor it for me and then come back and say, we saw all of this activity, it looks suspicious, but we also can validate that we believe nothing came of it, right? So there's a lot of smaller organizations that I think are also now struggling to figure out how do they come up to speed on cybersecurity and And automation is definitely an approach. I'm still on the fence on the whole AI and machine learning. And on my reasoning for that is the more log data that you consume, the more time that the machine learning and the AI needs to churn through that data in order to make a decision of, well, but this looks suspicious from the normal pattern that we would expect to see.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. There's a lot of buzzwords around that space, so it's important to be sort of crystal clear about what it actually can do versus can't do. So I guess a question around improving defenses, let's just say you're an organization that's doing kind of the hygiene stuff reasonably well, right? What other tools or strategies, like where would your next best spend of dollars for cybersecurity program enhancement be? You think you're doing the basics reasonably well and you kind of want to go a little bit further. Like where do you see that being the most valuable? Is it on, I don't know, better inventory management? Is it better threat detection? Is it better vulnerability management? There's a lot of different places you can go in or directions you can go in. Where do you see that as being a good spend of money?
So
it's a hard question. And I don't think there's a really great answer. I'm just interested in your opinion.
It is a hard question, right?
Yeah.
And I'm a firm believer that user education is the foundation, right, to a good program, because it takes your organization from having a security team to having a security culture, right, of people who are much more aware of what is risky behavior and less likely to engage in it, which means that your security team can focus more on the actual threats and the technical activities. But I think as it matures, then you need to consider what the other surface areas of attack are, right? And there's a great military term that somebody mentioned to me a couple of years back about turning the table and looking at your organization as though you're on the other side, like you're the attacker. And what are those surface areas that are potentially exposed, right? Is it your application environment, right? And so maybe the spending goes towards ensuring that, there's been a huge spike that some of my peers and I have noticed in the past 2 quarters of bot traffic, hitting application firewalls and like that at an abnormally high rate. That one of my colleagues said it was all they could do in order to keep one of their websites from being taken down. Or maybe it's about the education or the vulnerability management. I think they're all, there's no one area that I think can be ignored, but it all depends on where your risk profile is.
Yeah.
Paul brings up some really good points, and I see some points in the chat too. User education is great. User education is important, but there's a lot of controversy in the industry that also states that you can train as much as you possibly want. Will it end up stopping the bad day? The answer to that's probably no, right? But what we think we should probably do is look at our education that we're providing, making sure it's relevant, and then really understanding how long does an employee really need to be with us to show a substantial improvement in their own hygiene, right? And start really taking a risk-based approach to your end users, right? So education is one thing. I mean, it's all multifaceted, right? People have been doing education, frankly, since I've been in technology for 20 years, right? It's nothing new. We're training more frequently now at smaller durations so people can, understand, have a little bit more focus. We're doing a lot more social engineering testing and things of that nature. And we always get people to click. We always get people to surrender passwords, right? And then I also saw another comment on the chat here about technical documentation. And I agree 100%, right? If we take a look at the technical teams and just the evolution of many organizations, take IT departments or development departments, there's always typically a lot of turnover. And unfortunately, if you don't have good, I would say, foundational principles of documenting your environment, you lose a lot of institutional knowledge when people walk out the door. And then it's almost like you're starting from square one to kind of relearn that all over again. So, I think for me personally, right, we talk about a lot of different types of companies, right? I know Paul works in a totally different sector than I do. I worked in a similar sector as Paul, and then I got back into technology. I think every sector has varying levels of complexity they need to deal with on a day-to-day basis. I find that software and technology is probably one of the more complicated ones, because you have a whole lot of privileged access all over the place and a lot of things that look bad because you got a lot of developers on staff, right? So I think it really comes down to, I'd love to see more investment in good risk management. And I'm an engineer by trade, but I do understand the value of truly understanding how to get the message across to our executives and change that culture in a way where we all know what's most important to the company, so we can be extra aware when we're attacked that, oh, they're asking for this type of information, or they're asking me to do this type of thing, that, oh yeah, this is material to the company.
Yeah,
right?
that's a good point.
We're very general in our approach
Yeah.
to awareness training.
Yeah, targeted awareness training to really like sort of introduce risk management concepts to important stakeholders, I think is a really great idea, versus just, watching a video around how phishing is bad. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. I think the last segment of our panel discussion is going to be around the cybersecurity talent shortage. So, I think everyone talks about this a lot, and I'm sure our audience is very interested in this domain. So I guess as leaders in your orgs, does anyone want to comment on immediate thoughts around this? How bad do you see this being? How has the pandemic played into this? What are your experiences around navigating the cybersecurity talent shortage?
I think it depends, right? I think it depends on what kind of organization you work in today. So if you're in a global organization, you have more levers to pull, right? Right. So I'm not reliant at all on in an all US based workforce, right? In fact, most of my more skilled, I would say, security professionals come out of my Romania area, right? So they're from there, and then we have a team in India, so 3 locations. I think it depends, right? I think that a lot of us, especially those of us that can only really source talent from the US, we have challenges kind of communicating the reality of the job market to our talent acquisition folks internally, to say, hey, salaries have gone up substantially. This is not a competitive offer to even lure talent away, right? So if you need like a DevSecOps engineer or something like that, and you want them to go to a company that's maybe not all that attractive from a name brand perspective, you're going to have to pay more money to kind of lure those type of people out, right? So I think that's one of the challenges, is that some of it's self-inflicted, where we just aren't able to pay the market rate in some instances. I'd be curious to hear from the other panelists on what they're kind of seeing.
Yeah, I saw you unmute yourself, Ron. So
Yeah, I mean, my view on it is slightly different. I think that we work a lot with potential, right? Where there's, I think, too much of a focus on security certifications and time in role and all of this great stuff. And there's credence to that. And there's some roles that you're going to have experience for, right? And you're going to have those requirements around. But unfortunately, a lot of times, I think that the industry has made it almost prohibitive for people to get into the industry. It's almost like we're trying to keep people out in some instances. When you look at some of the job descriptions, it's like, oh, I want somebody with 5 years of experience to be an entry-level analyst. Well, it's just not realistic. So a lot of times what we do is, in our organization in consulting, and when we're hiring analysts in, and even for some of our clients, when we're looking at CISO level positions, we look at the capabilities and sort of the background and experience, the career progression, the technical abilities that somebody has, and the ability to learn, right? When I'm looking at a penetration tester, if, one of the best penetration testers I know had never done pen tests before, but when introduced to some of the concepts, the guy, jumped on these things and learned them very quickly. So his ability to learn, he was a critical thinker, he's a problem solver, he's a tinkerer. That's the type of stuff that we look for, and that we try to ferret out when we're doing the interview process and when we're screening folks. It's not necessarily just can you run these 20 different tools? Like, do you have this stuff on your resume? Because I think that's where the industry has gotten a little bit junky, right? We've put all of these requirements on people, and it's not realistic. if we want to solve this shortage, then let's start hiring people that have the capability to do the work, right? We have analysts that, I think some of the best analysts that we have in our organization right now got a technical background, but they got a technical background secondarily to working primarily in law enforcement. And why? Because they were detectives, right? They were beat cops who turned into detectives that have that natural curiosity to continue to ask questions. And then guess what? You arm them with the technical capability to do that work. And all of a sudden you have a great analyst.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there was a Twitter thread, I think it was this morning, where there was an entry-level job posting where you needed to have a CISSP, which is literally, yeah.
Like who does it? You can't get it.
Yeah.
Like you can't do it. And I think that the culture almost in the industry is that while we say we have a shortage, a lot of times, if you look at how people perceive or talk about jobs, it's almost like we want to have a shortage to tell people how important we are as an industry. And it's like, no, like I'll sit and help anybody out. I've helped numerous people out. Just
I don't know that it's an industry. I don't know that it's entirely an industry problem, though, right? And I do agree that there's a serious problem out there, and part of it is there are a couple factors that I think that play into this. One, going back to smaller organizations, right? They realize that they've got large gaps. And thank you. Somebody just sort of almost quoted me before I even said it, right? They said the purple squirrel. I was going to say the purple unicorn syndrome, right? Where I've had conversations with recruiters who said, hey, I've got this job requirement from a company. Can you help explain it for me? And I'll look it over and I'll go, oh yeah, that's like 3 different people. Right, and they're trying to cram like 3 high-end people into one position and pay them for that one role. So I think that's part. That's one of the factors that I see that impacts a lot of this. I think another factor that I see is organizations who don't understand the differences in the roles or in the requirements or even what the certifications mean, right? And they just know they want to find somebody who's talented out of a pool of X number of candidates, some of whom may or may not be qualified, right? Somebody earlier in the chat asked, does it make sense to hire somebody outside of, security into a security role? And I remember when I first started working, one of my favorite developers, who I had a great deal of respect for, had a Bachelor of Science in archaeology, right? He didn't have a background in computer science. And another colleague of mine recently said one of the best additions they made to their security team was somebody who had a bachelor's degree in marketing, right? Because they were taking that marketing knowledge and experience and applying it to cybersecurity and how to market cybersecurity within the organization, right? To get more backing and support within other stakeholders. So there's a lot of different things that I think play a factor in the whole how recruiting and jobs are coming up in the world. And I think a lot of it is because of a lack of understanding from people that are involved, and when they create these job postings, or they just don't have the resources, but they know they want to get.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree completely. I mean, I think, cybersecurity has such a wide umbrella to an organization, from selling itself as a thing that we need to do to hunting and investigating kind of threats and everything in between. It's just a lot of diversity of thought is required to kind of implement a program from end to end. And I agree with you completely. There's skills that live in totally other industries that can totally be retrofitted into cybersecurity. And this industry is better because of that. And I also think once you're in the cybersecurity domain, some of the better technical skilled and sort of leaders that I've worked with, they sort of like go diagonal. Like they'll start in a SOC and then go to architecture, or start in architecture and then go to threat hunting, or start in AppSec and then go into, sysadmin. That cross-pollination of cybersecurity skills tends to make individuals extremely well-rounded and extremely competent at all general domains of the space.
And that's where I think, for the shortage that everybody feels, there's a huge benefit to potentially training internal staff into some of the roles, right? Because there's just not enough people to fill the roles as it stands right now. And with the pandemic, it feels like it's just gotten worse, right? And demand has gotten higher and the requirements have become more. But on the same token, there are people who are likely in your organization who would just don't understand what it means to be in cybersecurity, who might have the skills and the interest if given the opportunity, and might very well look at it as a point by which they become even more loyal to your organization, right? Because you gave them that opportunity to become something more.
Yeah, I agree 100%, Paul. And I think the other thing that I'm seeing in the industry that I haven't really seen before is we're actually seeing, every company is going to have some sort of digital presence to a certain extent to maintain a competitive advantage and beat out their competition, right? You're going to have some sort of digital presence. How robust? Who knows? But one of the things that I'm actually seeing is that a lot of companies are starting to go on these digital transformations that have not historically had modern skills in-house. So what we're seeing is, and I'm seeing this quite often now, is that we're seeing a lot of folks from the tech industry and software industry actually go into other industries to help them on their digital transformation. So I think we're seeing kind of a squeeze of talent where software and technology usually sees, a lot of the tech first and a lot of different processes first that other companies end up adopting. But they're actually pulling people out of the software and tech industry to make go work in healthcare or go work in insurance, right? That don't have these skills in house. But that also shows me that they actually haven't trained their internal people to keep current with the more modern times as well. So I think that also exacerbates the problem. And I'm actually seeing this quite often in security, right? If you want someone that knows how to, embed security within a CI/CD pipeline, you're probably going to pull those resources out of the tech and software industry, right? So I just think it's making the problem even worse.
Yeah. So I guess in the last few minutes, I just want to tackle some of the Q&As so we don't leave people hanging here. Related to what we're just describing, someone is asking, how do we help senior leaders learn how to mitigate attacks against them? Are there trainings for these elders? There's only so much we could do as caretakers to help protect their networks. I guess, how do you train executives in cybersecurity is really the question.
I think it's inclusion in everything, right? You have to be able to get that ear, and Paul and Eric can probably talk about this a little bit more, but I know that from a consulting perspective for our CISO advisory practice, we've been asked more and more to be involved in board meetings or presentations with executive leaders so that they're aware of not only the entire, security organization and, what assessment activities there are or what incidents have occurred, but then also more strategic pieces. And when you have that type of stuff out there, as well as keeping them abreast of new things that are happening or new vulnerabilities or, whatever it may be, this is where the foundation for that information starts. And the security awareness, even at that senior executive level, is absolutely key to be able to not only just get that funding, but then also spark their interest in something a little bit new to them.
I mean, at the end of the day, Ron, that you hit the nail right on the head, right? I mean, these are at the end of the day, they're not security decisions, they're business decisions, right? And that's why we have to keep talking about risk. So if I take $4 million off the table, I'm taking $4 million out of product development potentially, or HR, right? To kind of build their practice up. So you have to really make it inclusive. You have to, I would say, as a security leader, one of your main jobs is to provide context and an opinion, if asked, on what risks should be dealt with and how they would be burned down and the associated resources and dollar asked to burn down those risks to an appropriate level, right? And then let the business decide on if they're going to fund it or not, right? So kind of remove yourself a little bit and have the business make those decisions that's important for the company to protect itself, right? That's ultimately my job. And I think when you can get to that point, the execs are far more engaged because they feel part of the solution now, right? So I think that's really critical.
I can't reinforce what Eric said enough, right? I've actually watched over the last decade individuals who I knew were CISOs at organizations lose their seat at the table because they couldn't talk about risk in a business term, right? They could only talk in technical terms. And because they couldn't talk the same language, they just couldn't manage to maintain that level of representation with other business leaders, right? Because there's all sorts of different, there's finance, there's human resources, there's all of these other different business leaders who come to the table at that C-level. And if you can't take the step back from the technology and be able to both represent it, but represent it in a business manner, right? And why is this of value to the business, and what is the risk going to do, and how do we mitigate it? Or maybe we just have to accept some level of it, right? Then you're going to lose some of that voice.
Yeah, I agree. Great points. We have another question. I'm going to try to combine these. It's sort of changing topics a little bit back to the beginning around government and private sector partnerships. But I guess the spirit of the question is really, you know, as cyber becomes the new military stage and government is the one who has the authority to act on behalf of the United States, you know, how are you seeing the risks and benefits of partnering with the federal government to defend cyber attacks? Or defend against cyber attacks? Or does anyone want to comment on public-private partnerships around defense and you know, defending American companies from attacks?
There are some obvious immediate thoughts that come to mind, right? And InfraGard and the Electronic Crimes Task Force are two of them, right? InfraGard being the business relationship with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Electronic Crimes Task Force being the same relationship with the Secret Service, right? And both of them are really good at being able to provide that liaison between investigation and cybercrime. I personally haven't seen that, and I've got a couple of peers and friends that are in that DoD and military space, but I've never, from my roles, really partnered with them per se. I think there are a lot of great venues, though, to share information, whether it's with them or with other organizations in your sector. Primarily the ISACs come to mind really quickly.
Yeah, definitely one for the ISACs. So
Yeah, I mean,
cool.
My take on this is, Paul, you brought up great points. I would say those are great resources to take advantage of. Having worked, I would say, for a couple companies that have served a role as it might relate to our national security interests. If there's a level of engagement, they will come and seek you, right, for that partnership, right? So I think that's, I don't encourage everybody just to reach out to their local FBI field office and strike up a conversation at Starbucks, right? Doesn't typically work that way. The other side of this is that, I think the relationship between the public and private sector can be a little delicate at certain times because everybody has their own motivations, right, for what they want that relationship to look like. And, especially as the private sector company, you got to be careful on what you share as well, right? So I think there's a lot of good information and a lot of good relationships that can come from this. But my experience engaging with various government agencies is they truly have a national interest as it relates to cybersecurity and are looking for partnerships with those companies that have a material impact on our national cyber.
Cool. Yeah. Well, it is 2 minutes of, and I know Emma and the motion team wanted to say a few parting words, but I just want to thank everyone for joining, and Ron and Eric and Paul. This was a great panel. I appreciate all of your insights in this discussion. So thank you all for joining us today. Emma.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of you. It was such a great conversation. I certainly enjoyed it, and I can tell by the chat that hopefully all of you guys did too. On the note of, talking about combating the talent shortage and creating a culture of upskilling and learning, if this is something that your company does well, I definitely encourage you to check out our upcoming annual Timmy Awards ceremony and nominate your company. You can fill out a nomination on our website and then have the chance to take home an award after our virtual ceremony in October. We would love to have you involved and have your company represented, so you can check out more information at techinmotionevents.com. Other than that, thank you again for joining today. We hope to see you all at our next event. Have a great long 4th of July weekend, and we will see you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.